Hello, guys and gals, and welcome. Welcome. So today I wanted to talk about a rather serious problem that is currently plaguing Path of Exile 2, and it's something that really deserves some going over. And what is that problem, you might be asking? Well, it's group play. Path of Exile 2 is very interesting, and it's a very fun game from a solo standpoint. And if all you ever play is single player, well then you're fine. You probably won't ever even notice the problem. But for people who have actually engaged in multiplayer content, like playing with your husband or your girlfriend or playing with your clanmates, or like for instance, if you have your own Discord like I do, and people are trying to play together on that, one thing that you'll notice relatively quickly is that group play just sucks balls. There's a lot of problems with group play, and I feel like one of the things that we're going to go over today is we're going to talk about why um, essentially what, and maybe even how you could potentially fix it. So I hope you'll join me in this. The number one problem in Path of Exile, as far as group play is concerned, is resurrecting allies sucks. I'm not even necessarily talking about the fact that you can't resurrect allies in, say, for instance, your, like your maps and whatnot. We're going to talk about that later. I'm just talking about like the actual process of resurrecting an ally. The overall interface, just simply to actually resurrect an ally, is very wonky. They often remain dead on the ground and have this huge thing above their head, which takes up way too much space. And despite the fact that the icon for this is literally as big as the waypoint, if not bigger, clicking on it is often sometimes difficult in that there's like a specific place on the resurrect button that you have to click. You also have to unfortunately hold on to the resurrect button. You can't just click it and, like move on. You have to literally find it, click it, and hold on to it for a specific period of time. The time that it takes to resurrect someone is often inordinately long, and on top of that, it is extremely easy to be interrupted in the resurrection progress. There's also no like amount of resurrection saved toward resurrecting a target. Like if you got really really close and just got hit at the last second, no, you have to start completely over from the beginning. On top of this, there's also other problems like the fact that bosses and encounters specifically seem to be designed in a way to prevent you from being able to resurrect anyone. Oftentimes, in quite a few boss battles, I've noticed that, well, there's really no way to resurrect anyone in those particular fights. Whether you want to or not, there's just not an opening that you can utilize to resurrect your friends. So, more often than not, they just simply stay dead. Another problem with this is that, well, you just end up sitting out most of the content. And this also dives into problem number two with resurrection, which is that you can't be resurrected in maps. Now, it wouldn't necessarily be as big of an issue if you couldn't be resurrected in maps, if maybe you could spectate and actually watch your friends while they're playing, but it kind of feels like you just get put into a timeout chair and, well, you just get to sit there while your friends do the map. And the only two options that you basically have at that point are to A, wait for your friends dutifully, like a good little friend, or to leave the group and go play on your own, which just incentivizes you to not play in the groups. Your group, on the other hand, has no choice either. They can't resurrect you, so they can either just continue the run, or they can cancel the run and lose the map and whatever other currency they've invested into the map, which ends up in a loss, and they can potentially start a new one. This is also just kind of poopy. Sitting out for prolonged periods of time is also stupid as well. Like, why in general in group play are we being forced to sit out? Like, it's like we're playing Fortnite, for God's sakes. And, when you die in Fortnite, you have to literally sit there and wait for your team. Either that or you leave and go play, a solo or just like queue up by yourself. Because waiting for your friends for their 20 to 30 minute, match to end is stupid. And why do you want to do that? Might as well just go play something else. Um, Moving on to the next one is FPS slash server FPS, which is frames per second, of course, practically zero. So in group content, a lot of the times when I would join up with another team member, like for instance when I joined up with Leon, or when I joined up with Bruzak, or when I joined up with several other members, they would often have builds that spammed abilities at such a high value, or such a high speed, that well, it just wasn't even remotely possible, if that makes any sense. It wasn't even remotely possible to actually have gameplay during this. So like you're sitting there and you're trying to actually, play the game. You're trying to actually do the content, kill the monsters, like play your character, use off your abilities. And the moral of the story is you can't really. Unfortunately, you just end up in a situation where a lot of the times you're stuck with 0 frames. And not necessarily because your computer can't handle it, but sometimes it's literally a problem with the, what's the term I'm looking for? The server itself. It's like server frame rate is going down to 0. And the server frame rate gets so low that oftentimes you end up in a situation where you're just standing there looking at like 1 to 2 frames per second, if not 0 frames per second, while you're in a group with another player. I've had this happen to me many times while I was playing Path of Exile 2, and it's just another one of the reasons why I felt like group play was just absolutely stupid, and I didn't want to participate in it. In fact, it was more often than not that whenever this happened, I was very much so likely choosing not to engage in that particular content. A random trade in the middle of my video. Totally didn't expect that, but whatever. Now, this is just one of many things. Another is the desync of questing. So, as I played around in Path of Exile 2, I leveled up with quite a few different people. I leveled up with, obviously, with like kinship members. I leveled up with non-kinship members. We were in groups during the campaign, and we were also in groups outside of the campaign. And one of the things that frustrated me was the difficulty in keeping our quests synced up, and we often had to backtrack so that we could make sure that our quests were in sync. And it happened a lot, especially in Act 3 and in Act 2, where problems would occur and our quests were constantly getting desynced. We constantly had to go back to the person who had the furthest back, essentially, like completion of the quest line, so that we could continue forward. And it was just a pain in the butt constantly keeping track of the desync and questing. It's just another one of the various things that are going on with party play being poopy. Another one is map progress. So speaking of maps, as we talked about earlier, of course you're only getting one death in them, and there was a couple different various problems. Is that, well, map progress itself is tied almost explicitly to the player who's in charge of the game, like the one who's the party leader. So the person who is actually progressing their map, the party leader, is the only one that is going to get any progress on their map whatsoever. This incentivizes, your group players to not want to do that. Like, why would they want to join a party with somebody else who is potentially, like completing their map, getting to citadels in their map, and you are not? Having the map progress with one player and not any of the others is something that they probably need to address. Because it really does incentivize the player to not want to be in a group when they're doing their endgame content. Why would I want to join a group with somebody else so that I can not progress my map for however many maps that we do? Even assuming that nobody dies in the maps, and even assuming that we're able to complete and progress properly, then that means that all the progress is going toward the party leader. Even if we split the progress, like say for instance you had 6 people and you split the progress between those 6 people and everybody alternated party lead so that you could do one map per person, 6 times in a row essentially until you get to the next person and round about. So if you do like 12 maps, everybody's done 2 maps of progress. At that point you've done 12 maps and you've only gotten 2 maps of progress on your actual map. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever, and it's something that they really need to fix. Monster difficulty in groups. This is also something that's rather interesting, is that It feels like monster difficulty in groups is a hell of a lot more penalizing than being by yourself. If we make a general consensus and we say, okay, well, if I'm a solo player, a monster has, 100 HP. And if I'm in a group, the monster has 200, like with two people. And if he's three people, then that's 300. And four people is 400, and so forth and so on. So everybody has to carry their weight. And you would think that, that's how it works, but it doesn't seem to be that way. I'm not sure what the actual math is, but it definitely seems to be more than just like two times the XP for two people or three times the, I mean, two times the HP for two people. It seems to be a lot more than that because the monsters seem inordinately more difficult in group play than they do when you're solo. To the point where it seems to incentivize players to just not do group play. Why do you want to do group play if the game is going to be much, much, much more difficult than if you're doing it by yourself and you can handle all content by yourself? And then when you get into a group content, it feels like the monsters are an exceedingly factor greater than two times of what the difficulty should be. Not being able to see the ground. Oh my dear Lord Jesus. I've grouped up with players from range characters, mages, various types of characters across the board in Path of Exile 2. In fact, we had quite a large population of players in Path of Exile 2 for the launch, and oh my God, minion characters, characters using fire spells, lightning characters using lightning spells. It was often next to impossible to even see the ground, let alone know what was going on. And if you were a ranged character and you didn't necessarily need to get within melee range, it wasn't like too ridiculously bad because you could hang back as far as you could possibly hang back and just hope not to get hit by anything. But for melee characters, for any kind of character that actually needs to get in there, warrior, monk, etc., oh my God, it is so painful. You can't see the ground, you can't see the monsters, you can't see yourself, you can't see pretty much anything. So playing in a group with these people is impossible. One of the things that they definitely need to work on is they need to work on the ability to hide effects. And it's not necessarily that I want it to be hidden by default, but like if I can't play the game with somebody else because I can't avoid the mechanics that are killing me, because I can't see the mechanics that are killing me, because I can't see the monsters that are killing me. I mean, it begs the question, are they deliberately trying to force people to not play together? And that brings me to my final point, which my final point is that Path of Exile 2 seems to incentivize playing alone. In fact, I have a whole list here of various things, and it's my last point on this list, which is it. It seems to incentivize you playing by yourself. I mean, if you look at everything as a whole, that the monsters are far more difficult in group play than they are solo. That you can't resurrect in maps. Like the burning of multiple portals. In fact, I guess you could probably add this in here too, although it's technically part of number 10. Number 9 is burning multiple portals for maps. So if you're playing in maps, you spawn a map, you get multiple portals. You get, what is it, 5 portals or 6 portals? I can't remember, right? But essentially, when you go in, like if you have 6 people, everybody takes their own portal and everybody burns a portal. So if you go in with a full group of 6, then all your portals are gone. Just another way that they're incentivizing you not to do group play. And everything seems to be designed around this. It's you can go faster when you're in solo play. The builds that are some of the most crazy builds that are easy clear of the game are generally not designed in any way, shape, or form to be in group play at all. They generally spam the screen with like 10,000 effects to the point where nobody could ever play with them anyway. They're usually extremely fast or extremely laggy to the point of ridiculousness. The rewards are not really multiplied for group play, so it often just feels like you're getting pretty much the same thing. I think you get what, like a 10% increase in rarity or something like that for being in a group, and it just doesn't really feel like the rewards themselves are very good for group play. The map doesn't progress in group play. So, for instance, if you are in a 6-player group and one person is the leader, then he's going to get all the progress and you get none. There doesn't seem to be a lot of reasons, as far as I can tell, to encourage people to play together. And on top of that, it seems like the majority of the mechanics in the game are designed in a way to punish people for grouping up, especially those who are the melee variety. Because when you are a melee character that's grouped up with a sorceress, a minion character, or something that's spamming effects all over the place that so you can't see, you're more often than not just going to die because you can't see what is dangerous. You can't see where the monsters are. You can't see where the ground based effects are to get out of the way. So again, you're incentivized as a like melee character just simply to play by yourself. Um, I mean, the problems are numerous when it comes to group play, and I have to say that that for a game that is came out in 2024 2025 era, it's really quite sad that a game like Diablo 2 that is 24 years old, a game like Diablo 4 that is hailed, by many people, even Path of Exile 2 players, as a horrible game because they don't like the way that the mechanics work or they don't like the itemization. But these games definitely are better in terms of group play than Path of Exile 2. Diablo 2 Resurrected is by far greater than Path of Exile 2 in group play. Diablo 2 has a player count of 8. You can have 8 people in a game playing together in the same place. You can see what's going on. You don't have to worry about on-death effects constantly, murdering you. About the only on-death effect in the entire friggin' game is Fire Enchanted, Cold Enchanted, and Neelithak's Corpse Explosion, which is very unique to his specific area and him specifically. There's very little in the game that has to be worried about when it comes to like on death effects. In fact, 8 people can play relatively well together in Diablo 2 Resurrected with ease. Diablo 4 had its share of on death effect problems when it first launched and has practically fixed the majority of them since season 5, I think. And season 7, it's gotten even better. The on death effects are very rarely even a problem in Diablo 4 anymore. They still exist and they still will kill you occasionally, but they have definitely been fixed to the point where they're much more understated than they were in the past. And grouping with 4 people in Diablo 4 is 100% possible. You don't really have to worry about too many characters with crazy number of abilities and effects that cover up the screen. There was a little bit of that back in the original Diablo 4 launch. Like, for instance, the Necromancer's Corpse Explosion with the shadow effect was covering up the screen. And there was a couple other small things like that that were addressed relatively quickly. But for the most part, you won't have an issue grouping up with other people. Diablo 2 Resurrected, Diablo 4, and many other games that I've played ARPG wise are designed much better when it comes to group play. And as I played Path of Exile 2 for, what was it, like 30 some odd days, of course I can pull up a list because why not? Let's go to my contents and let's go to my live streams. So if we take a look at my Path of Exile content, I have, well, let's see what we got here. Day 30, so 1, 2, we got 30 days. Well, 30 days. I did 30 days of live stream, and it was a lot of live streams, anywhere between 8 to 12 hours, sometimes multiple live streams in a single day, which added up to a whole lot of gameplay. And I just did not enjoy any of the group play that I had participated in. I started to realize that it was affecting how I played the game. I normally play together with other people. I made a kinship to play together with other people. There's tons of other people within the kinship who enjoy playing the game. But for the most part, when it came to Path of Exile 2, I realized that, well, I was mostly playing by myself. Although occasionally I managed to get people to group up with me for like the campaign, which wasn't too bad when it came to group play, because in the campaign, most of the time, if you manage to keep your quest states the same, which was a bit of an issue, nobody was really overpowered at that point. Like nobody was spamming abilities to an nth degree, which made the screen literally cluttered with all manner of craziness, abilities, minions, and everything. So the characters hadn't reached the point where that became a really big problem yet. And so for the campaign, at least, grouping was okay. You could have one or two or sometimes even three people in a group together, like with somebody else, so like a total of like four people, and it didn't generally go too poorly. Although there were builds and classes that were worse than others when it came to cluttering the screen with immensely large numbers of attacks. And I do remember specifically Leon's lightning ability lagging up the game even during the campaign, which was just insane. And I looked to make sure that it wasn't just my computer lagging. And for those of you who are wondering what my specs are, I've got 128 gigs of RAM. I've got a RTX 3090 graphics card and a 5800X 3D processor. So my computer's not horrible. I mean, am I running a 4090 or rather a 5090 now, right? Am I running a 5090 and do I have like the best CPU that's ever existed? No. But the system that I'm running is certainly not bad by any measure, any stretch of the imagination. And the FPS problems that would occur for me were ridiculous. Um, and it just simply like getting to the point where I realized after about 30 days of gameplay that the game was pushing me towards solo play. It wasn't so much that it was incentivizing solo play. It was that, and we can add this as a number 11, we can add it as simply that like it felt like the game was pushing me toward solo play. That the game wanted me to play solo. That the game literally hated, and I think we can put this here, the game hated multiplayer. It feels like the game literally hates it if you play multiplayer. And I think hate is the appropriate word here. That after playing for such a long period of time with the game, trying to do multiplayer, failing repeatedly while playing with other people, just going into the maps, trying the end game process, playing melee characters, playing ranged characters, playing spellcasters, and it just feels like the game hates multiplayer. Not just generally advocates against it, not just incentivizes you not to play multiplayer, but it feels like the game goes out of its way to punish you for any multiplayer activity that you participate in, to a degree which essentially pushes you toward a solo play. Now, how can they potentially fix this? I promised I would go over ways to potentially fix this, and I do have a rather large list here. So let's talk about each bullet point and how they could potentially fix it in the future. Number one, the resurrect panel and timings are awful. This one is got to be the simplest to fix. They've got to do an overhaul on the resurrection actual like panel that pops up on the screen. It would be really nice if that resurrection panel wasn't 18,000 miles big and had a very tiny place for you to click on it. It would also be great if clicking on it didn't require you to hold down the button, but instead clicking on it just simply activated the resurrect. I had many times while I was trying to resurrect people where I would try to click on it and somehow my mouse would fall off of it, or I would accidentally let go for a half a second, ruining the timing. And Diablo 4 does it better. Just let us click on the person, have the resurrect start, and that's it. It doesn't need to be some overly complicated system, but the system that's currently in place just isn't sufficient. Not being able to resurrect in maps, you got to figure out something around this. The end game in this game is literally maps, and basically putting people in timeout like this, putting people in timeout because they die during a map is really stupid. You already have many systems in place which could potentially fix this. Like, for instance, you have the number of portals, which could potentially be used as a method to control the number of deaths, requiring the person to retreat back to town, which then, taking a portal, would remove one of those portals from the list, essentially enabling you to control the number of deaths total that are allowed inside the map. Diablo 4 does this better because it literally allows you to control like how many deaths you have, right? So in most situations in hard content, they give you 4 deaths total for the group, and once you exceed 4 deaths total, the map has failed. But in this particular case, you have no deaths total. You've got 0. So if somebody dies, they go straight back to a little timeout chair, and they get to sit there like absolute poopy doopy heads. On top of this, they can't even really spectate. And I think this is also really important, is that if you're going to time people out for dying within a map, it would be nice if they could at least spectate what was going on inside the map. Now, I'm not advocating for this because I would much rather just have more resurrections on the map than a spectate function. But if you're hardcore, hardlined, like we want 1 death per map no matter what, I'm sorry, you guys suck, stop dying, then we need a spectator function so we can actually have something to do while we're sitting there in our timeout chair. So like for instance, if we join a group with 3 other people and it's a 4-man group and one of us dies by accident, at least the 4th person can sit there and spectate the group switching between players to see what the hell is going on so that they're not bored to tears or tempted to go run a map on their own. It would be nice if we could at least have some sort of spectator behavior. FPS/SFPS basically 0. I mean, I don't really know what really needs to be said here. Builds that reduce the server FPS to 0 just need to be nerfed into the dirt. You've got to find some way to get rid of these. Having a group set up where somebody in the group has a build that completely disables all other players from being able to participate in content because they're holding down a button and firing off 10 trillion arrows into the air, which then land and cause the frame rate of the game to literally tank into the single digits, is not acceptable gameplay for any type of group content. And I don't know exactly what to say other than this. It needs to be fixed. If I join a group and somebody is spamming an ability that reduces my frame rate to 0, then we've got issues, and they need to be adjusted. Desynced questing. This is just something that has to be addressed on a regular basis all over the board. If there's any problems with people desyncing and questing, it needs to be fixed. You need to be a little bit more lenient with this stuff or something. I don't know exactly what needs to happen. But 2 people shouldn't have to constantly backtrack to help a specific person progress through that part of the quest that literally 2 or 3 people just completed. And while I was questing in Path of Exile 2, the number of times that we had to backtrack to help somebody complete a quest so that they could catch up with the rest of us was insane. It felt like it was happening all over the place in Act 2 and in Act 3, not so much in Act 1, which was a lot more lenient because, well, the quests were further apart and generally easier, so it didn't really matter too much. Map progress only going to the owner. A really good solution for this would be to allow other members to gain tokens which they could spend on map progress on their maps. In other words, if I'm in a 6-man group and we're progressing maps and we complete 6 maps, then everybody in the group, with the exception of the owner, who is progressing maps, should obtain map tokens. The map tokens could then be spent to progress the map in their world. They would not get rewards for the map. They would not be able to use any of their maps on this, and they would not be able to do pretty much anything except for put stones in towers. But for the most part, these tokens could be used to progress their map if they so deemed to. And in this way, it would allow the people who are playing together on maps to be able to progress everything at once instead of the 5 people that are joining the 6th to basically have their maps on hold while they're in the group progress. In my opinion, anything like this that prevents one person from getting progress is going to immediately de-incentivize that person from being in a group. Once I find out that I'm not going to make any progress on my map by being in a group with you, I'm more likely going to go off on my own and do my own map to get my own progress. And that's really the truth of the matter. Number 7, monsters seem much more difficult in a group than not in a group, right? Than just 2 times HP. It shouldn't be such a huge increase in difficulty from single to double, or double to triple, or triple to quadruple, or quadruple to centuple, or centuple to I can't remember, sextuple. I can't even remember the name. It's when you increase the difficulty too much for two people. For instance, if it takes person number 1 5 minutes to kill a boss, and it takes person number 2 5 minutes to kill a boss, and in the group it takes 15 minutes to kill the boss, you've tripled the difficulty, not doubled it, right? And it seems like, to me, at the very least, when I was playing in most multiplayer scenarios, that more often than not, the difficulty for grouping was more severe to a degree which incentivized you to play alone. And obviously, the solution for this is, well, rebalance it. Figure out what the hell went wrong with the way that you're increasing the difficulty of the monsters in group play and make it more fair. Because obviously it doesn't seem to be set up precisely right. Not being able to see the ground. The fix for this is twofold. Number one, you've got to get away from allowing players to spam abilities to the point where literally you can't see anything. It's just stupid. This also feeds back into point number 4 with the 0 server FPS problems, which is where certain builds are completely and utterly destroying the server FPS so that anyone grouping with them can not get basically any gameplay. And this loops right back to can't seeing the ground. So if you have somebody who's spamming these abilities at a rate which makes it so that the ground is unseeable and that you literally can't play with them, well, then it needs to be fixed. Number one, these builds that spam abilities to that degree have to be rebalanced in a way that allows them to still function, but not spam abilities to that degree. In other words, what's the difference between spamming an ability 100 times and getting 100,000 damage, and spamming an ability 50 times and getting 100,000 damage? If they rebalance it so that there's less abilities spammed but more damage done, then they can maintain the builds without nerfing them, while also fixing the problem of not being able to see the ground. The second way that you could potentially deal with this, which I think is a very important one, is just simply making it so that you can adjust and control which things that you can see. I hate to bring up a game that's like ridiculously old, but I want to bring up a game that's ridiculously old. Final Fantasy 11 Online, which came out around like the year 2000 something. I can't even remember the exact release date. I think it was like 2002. But Final Fantasy 11 Online had a feature in it that was absolutely amazing. The raids in this game could go up to 64 players, and because the raids could go up to 64 players, there was a menu that allowed you to control very strategically what abilities and what things that you could see and what you could not see, allowing you to very minutely and very specifically adjust the overall performance of your game by controlling what abilities you were able to see and what abilities you didn't want to see. Which, believe it or not, is a feature from a game from 2002. We're talking about 23 years ago. This game has this feature, and in Path of Exile 2, they desperately need a feature that was in a game from 23 years ago. Let us turn on / off what we see. I guarantee you that doing this would allow many, many players the ability to actually play together, because they would be able to control and turn off essentially the things that are preventing them from being able to see the ground. And not being able to see the ground is more than just simply like, hey, I can't see the game. No, because if you can't see the ground, you can't see the explosions, you can't see the monsters, you can't see just about anything that's going to kill you, and you're more often than not going to die. And this feeds back into problem number 2, because in maps, you are more likely to die because, well, guess what? You can't see the ground. So it's all a cyclical loop here, is that we're running into this problem with group play that seems to be based around multiple issues feeding into each other. We not being able to see the ground is one issue that is fed by the fact that the gameplay from certain builds is bringing the actual like frame rate of the game down to freaking zero. On top of this, not being able to resurrect in maps is being fed into by the fact that we can't see the ground, because when we can't see the ground, we're dying a lot, which is, of course, exasperating this issue and making it even worse. If we're trying to be resurrected within content, this is also an issue because we have to resurrect people more often because, again, people can't see the freaking ground, and they can't see the ground because of these stupid builds that are literally causing the server FPS to drop to zero. Like I said, it's just like a cyclical loop of problems. The game seemed to be incentivizing solo play. Let's talk about what they could potentially do to fix this. Well, first off, they need to make it less punishing for groups to group. There are a bevy of issues here that can potentially be fixed that would potentially make it much nicer to play in groups. But on top of this, they need to put some type of incentive for the players to actually be able to group together. The 10% rarity increase from being in a group with somebody else is dog water poop. Like, wow, big whoop. I mean, honestly, they could put like a 2 times quantity in there for having 2 people in the group, and it still might not be enough, depending on what the hell is going on. The group play just is painful, and the incentives for playing group play are awful. In fact, in general, the incentives for playing solo are extremely good. And maybe this is actually proof in the pudding of what needs to be fixed, which is that if the group play incentives are so bad and the solo play incentives are so good, perhaps they need to reduce the solo play incentives and increase the group play incentives. It, in reality, should be balanced in a way that promotes people to play group play and does not prevent people from playing solo play. I shouldn't be getting into the game and being like, well, I need to group up because solo play sucks and groups just have it better. And it shouldn't be the opposite way either, where I need to get into the game and be like, oh, group play sucks and I would rather play solo play 100% of the time. It needs to be somewhere in the middle where people are more willing to join group play because the incentives are okay, and they're more willing to do solo play because the incentives are okay. If I had to balance it out right now, what I think it is, it's about 90% solo play and about 10% group play. That's about what we're probably looking at right now. 10% is going to be things like, hey, I have a citadel and I don't want to die and lose it. Can you join just so that I can have a backup in case I'm an idiot and die like a fool? Or, like, hey, I'm a level 1 character. Does anybody want to group up with me for some campaign runs? And then the 90% is basically everything else. Burning multiple portals for maps isn't really an issue that needs to be fixed so much as it's an issue that is a problem because of all the other issues. It makes it more difficult to go back to town and sell loot. It makes it more difficult to go back to town for any reason. Because, of course, if you have a large group, you're going to burn up all the maps, all the portals for the map almost instantaneously, which is rather unfortunate. This is also bad for disconnects because I've noticed that when you disconnect, a lot of the times you're forced to go back through the map as well because it will often boot you back to your guild hideout instead of letting you go directly back into the map, which burns another one of your portals. I would imagine that if they fixed a lot of the other problems, like not being able to be resurrected in maps, fixed the ground clutter, made it so that you died less due to stupid reasons, fixed a lot of the zero FPS issues from the server, that the burning multiple portals on maps wouldn't be as big of an issue as it currently is, but because of all those things, it is bad. So fixing it probably just needs to fix the other things, which will make that less punishing. The game seems to hate multiplayer. I mean, that goes right into like number 9, where we're talking about the game seems to incentivize solo play, but it really does. Like, it really, really does seem to hate, like, seething level hates of multiplayer. I don't know exactly why. I'm not sure exactly why it seems to hate multiplayer too much. I feel like somewhere along the line something was lost. I know that Path of Exile originally copied Diablo 2 Resurrected, but Diablo 2 Resurrected was an absolutely amazing multiplayer experience. Being in groups of 8 and running chaos or running freaking bail runs or doing just about anything like Bloody Foothills back in the day was absolutely amazing, and it was fun. And I don't know where we went wrong between Diablo 2 Resurrected and Path of Exile 2, because that experience doesn't exist in this game. And grouping up is painful. The actual like boons of grouping up are awful. The penalties for grouping up are awful. Like in general, there's pretty much no reason to group up with your friends at all. And you might be saying to yourself, "Well, that's just your opinion, and you don't really know what you're talking about." Well, you know what? You might be right. But let's take a look at a post by some other people who were recently looking at the same exact problem, right? So let's take a look at this post right here that was on January 20th of 2025, which really wasn't very long ago. Endgame is bizarrely multiplayer hostile, he says. This post is by Treatus number 0514. I play games like this with my best friend and sometimes with some other friends. Have for over a decade. PoE 2 worked well for that in the campaign, aside from some Act 3 getaway wonkiness, which I think is fixed now, but mapping really isn't great multiplayer. Especially compared to something like Diablo 4 that does it really well, there's two main problems. Number one, the more players you have, the more effect clutter there is, and it becomes really hard to see what's going on. This is also a problem in the campaign, but there are fewer effects at lower levels and little in the way of failure penalties. So occasionally mixing up an ally ground effect and an enemy ground effect is annoying or amusing, but not a major problem. It's obviously a much bigger problem when endgame builds can cover the whole screen in stuff. Endgame enemies can do huge amounts of damage, and you take significant penalties for dying. It's not that hard of a fix either. Add an option to dim or thin out ally skill effects so that enemy ones are easier to see and everything is fine, and I've seen other games do this and it works pretty well. Yep, it's another one portal per map thread. Fundamentally, the whole problem there in multiplayer is that if someone dies, they're no longer playing, they're watching the rest of the group play, or otherwise just waiting for the map to finish to get playing again. You can't revive them, and if they drop to go do a solo map, you're no longer playing together. This strongly encourages just doing easy maps because doing something actually challenging carries a significant risk of not being able to actually play together, which is the entire point of friends trying to play together. Considering how much server infrastructure there is and how much effort obviously went into making multiplayer work in campaign, where it was quite a lot of fun, the game just seems to not want you to actually do it in endgame, and it feels off. Even more so when you consider that they say that they want players to socialize. It's apparently one of the reasons for trading being so prominent, despite that being transactional with basically no interaction. But actually socializing by playing with people isn't treated as something they actually want you to do. Other people have replied, "Yep, I play Titan with a witch player heavily invested in minions, and I need to get in there and hit things. And I can barely see them all for my skeletons running around, firewalls, and the summoned skull spirit buffs, those firewall spawns. Then, because I can't see anything, I get dead. When playing in a group, this is the equivalent of being in a timeout chair. I might as well go play something else until the map is done, and if I'm going to go play something else, I have that much less reason to start PoE 2 in the first place. This design sucks for multiplayer." Item number 2, single portal is the biggest issue with my multiplayer, in my opinion. My daughter and I do maps, and when one person dies, we usually abandon the map entirely because the whole reason we're playing is to do stuff together. Allowing all 6 portals is the easy answer, and it already has precedent in Path of Exile 1. Adding a revive is a balance issue since multiplayer would have an advantage over single player, and I'm hoping this gets addressed. There's already a triple penalty going on here: loss of waystones and map rewards, loss of experience, and loss of anything lying on the ground. Yes, some of those don't apply so much to co-op as your mate can pick up the loots, but it's still a harsh penalty to die, co-op or not. You could add a revive until you run out of portals, or limited revives to constrain that some, while making it, oh, you got one shot by an effect you couldn't see underneath all the allied effects, go take a timeout like it is now. That would be pretty limited in a bigger group for how many deaths you can absorb, but it would be an improvement that isn't I can drag someone through by reviving them 50 times. Co-op has the added penalty you have to wait for your allies to finish or they abandon the map despite not dying. So that's an extra penalty versus single player that kind of offsets they can pick up loot, I think. +1, playing with my husband feels like a chore. Playing multiplayer sucks. All the people complaining about PoE 2 is hard. Never played multiplayer. They don't know what real hell is like and plays. They punish you for having friends, but make a game for 6 players. Make you your mind make you a single player or multiplayer. Don't punish me for having friends. Death in maps is my #1 gripe. Multiplayer unfriendliness is #2. Man, I thought one portal sucked solo. Multiplayer makes this issue so much worse. Something should be done for multiplayer minimum. One cannot help but wonder how much such a lust for loot can affect one person's mind. That must be his signature. I'm loving this game so far, but I must admit, party play feels really bad. It feels so bad that it makes me wish there was an option to appear offline. Wow. I am not smart enough to know how it can be solved, nor am I stupid or narcissistic enough to pretend that I know how. Therefore, I am not even going to give that any thought, especially since I enjoy Path of Exile 2 the way it is clearly meant to be played, solo. And he's not wrong. It feels like Path of Exile 2 was clearly meant to be played solo, and they put relatively zero thought into multiplayer. Edit, I think party play would benefit immensely if you could cycle through your teammates' POVs when you die. I said that, talking about spectating people, commonly referred to as spectator mode in FPS games. Fully agree, party play was great time through the acts, but now that we're in endgame and co-op just isn't fun anymore, no revives or retries just means that if anyone dies, they can either go look at their phone for 20 minutes or revive in town and play solo, which makes multiplayer pointless. Endgame is great solo so far, but my friends and I want to play together, and it's just not working. Moving on to the next one, multiplayer sucks, he says. I agree with Op completely. It's funny how Diablo 2, I talked about this, Diablo 2 is still a better game in group play with 8 players than games like PoE, which hate multiplayer, and even more so if you want to have the button yourself, without it being taken away from you. Plus, you don't see anything, and they kill you without knowing what killed you. It's a disaster that a game from 20 years ago is still better. I mean, Diablo 2 is a masterpiece, so... Yep, add option to dim effects. That I believe would solve most of the issues. Personally, I don't really like the one death. Who would prefer something similar to PoE 1? I understand why they want to keep it in the game, but they need to immediately improve visibility and substantiality. Now, see, that's the thing with me, is I'm not necessarily mad about the one death, but, you know, people, by definition, they're generally okay when rules are followed. Right? If it was my fault, if I was the idiot that made the mistake, then you take the lump and you move on. But a lot of the times, because of the penalty being so severe and the deaths being so stupid, many people just don't accept it. And rightly so. Why should you accept it? Why should you say, okay, well, I died to a completely random and unavoidable thing. You know, that wasn't my fault, but I guess I'll just take the lump and move on. People don't do that. And I think that's really the problem here is that a lot of the times when you're dying, it's not necessarily your fault, and you're being penalized with this one death mechanic for something that isn't necessarily your fault. If the one death mechanic would be fine if the game was properly balanced, the visibility was good, the substantiality of the skills was good, you could tell what the hell was going on the screen at all times, your friends weren't blocking the effects, and so that when you died, you realized immediately, like if every time you died in Path of Exile 2, you understood that this was my fault, I'm an idiot, I made a mistake, then the one death would be fine and it would be fair and nobody would complain. But the real meat and potatoes of the issue is that the majority of the time when you die in Path of Exile, it doesn't feel like your fault. It feels like you got gibbed by some cheesy mechanic that you couldn't see, or your friends were covering up the mechanic and there was basically no way for you to know what the hell was going on. I can count on my hand the number of times it felt like my death was actually legitimate in Path of Exile 2. This person replied, I agree with Op and with you on what you say. This game penalizes playing with other people. It makes us more isolated and individualistic. It was like that in PoE 1, and if it has changed, it's been for the worse. I hope that other games come out and are more friendly with multiplayer and ARPGs, because PoE is a disaster for that. And I say it like that because it is the truth. To top it off, it seems like PoE 2, the rich of GGG want to punish the poor with whips and scarcity, and I being poor, since I don't have a yacht like them. Even though I am poor, I don't like to play to suffer. I'm sorry, but I play to have fun and forget the problems that we poor people have. Maybe I should invest my time in something else, and in fact, I've stopped playing PoE 2 because I don't like being ignored by those who think they are above me, and as they already do in work and in real life. Wow, this guy's getting deep. And if I go to a game and they kick me around, well, it's not my game. I think that all those who have complaints like me should stop playing. Maybe then GGG will consider something of what we say. Otherwise, as rich people that they are, they will try to continue to punish the poor people with more shortages and problems. I don't really know about that last comment. That was a bit silly. I think this pretty much proves the point that I'm trying to prove, which is that people in general, when it comes to this game, have a relatively horrible time, playing multiplayer. And I'm not entirely sure why a game that is online, a game that allows for 6 people to play it, a game that in general has the mechanics built in for you to group, seems to be going out of its way to punish you for doing just that, grouping. I mean, it does have some mechanics which allow for some sharing of items, like through things like the guild stash, as an example. But the interactions are relatively small and relatively innocuous. Like, hey, I threw it in the guild stash. I'm gonna go back to mapping now. All right. You don't even join people's parties anymore. Like, I mean, the guild stash is amazing, but don't get me wrong. Like, when you're using it, you pretty much just throw the item in there and you just move on. Like, your character doesn't even enter the same zone or place as the other player that you're giving the item to, because you have a method of transferring the item which requires no contact. Just another way that they basically prevent you from grouping up with each other and, well, incentivizing you not to play multiplayer. I'm curious how you guys feel about this. I've already been talking for about 51 minutes, and I think it's been a pretty good video so far. What are your experiences with grouping in Path of Exile 2? Did you have fun with it? Did you hate it? Did you get to mapping and it was absolutely awful? Was it okay in the, like the campaign as you were leveling up, but got progressively worse the further along you got? Did you group up with somebody who had minions and just absolutely get annihilated because you couldn't see the floor? Did you have similar situations to me where you joined a group with somebody and the DPS, the character was able to reduce your frame rate to 0 through spamming specific abilities? I'd like to hear what you guys have to think. Be sure to hit that like button and the subscribe button if you enjoy the content, and as always, keep watching.